Hello, this is Joan Friedman, your host of ALLways, ALL for the Academy for Lifelong Learning, associated with Cape Cod Community College on beautiful Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The purpose of this broadcast is to introduce the Academy to a broad audience. We plan to introduce you to our wonderful coordinators, talk about our curriculum, events, catalogs, our many publications, and introduce you to our members. Cape Cod, being the beautiful natural resort area that it is, inspires many interesting people to live and to work here. And we like to think that our members are what makes us sparkle like pebbles on the beach. And today I have one of our members with us. This is Dr. Anton Yereniuk. Anton and I have been Zoom friends for 3 years. We met each other virtually when COVID started in a course called Global Futures by Dr. Tom Murphy. And we have stayed together as a group for 3 years. This is the first time I've met Anton face to face. So I can actually say I met my good friend for the first time today. Anton has a very compelling story to tell us. Anton's family is from Ukraine. His parents immigrated to the United States a generation ago, and part of his immediate family is still in Ukraine. The story that he has to tell us about Ukraine's past and Ukraine's present is heartbreaking and beautiful, and I'm so happy that he agreed to come and speak with me or be part of this podcast. Actually, his family's story is so compelling that this will be a 2-part series. This first podcast will cover the history of Ukraine to the recent Russian invasion on February 21st of 2022. The second podcast, which we'll tape right after this, and probably launch a month after this is actually launched, will be a brief discussion of the invasion and Ukrainian nationalism. It'll introduce you to Anton's family history and his family's foundation that is involved in the current refugee struggle. I'd like to introduce my good friend, Anton Yereniuk. Anton, I am so appreciative of your time and your effort. And I know that you have a lot that you want to share with us.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a pleasure to see you in person after 3 years of Zooming. What I'm going to do today is discuss a timeline of Ukrainian history. It'll be brief, but I want to again emphasize how important it is for the world to understand that Ukraine is not Russia. Ukraine is an independent, sovereign nation with its own cultural history. So let's go back to 800 AD. Slavic people in what is now Eastern Europe got together in the area around Kiev called Rus. Moscow, interestingly, did not exist for centuries. They were connected, the Rus people were connected to the northern Scandinavian empires. So 988 AD, Vladimir the Great accepted Christianity under the Greek Orthodox Patriarchy out of Constantinople. That's the origin of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Kiev became the first of the independent city-states of Rus. We go to 1200 AD, the Mongol invaders, who later became known as the Tartars, swept from the east and conquered the Ukrainian plains all the way to Poland. Their homeland was the Crimean Peninsula. 1300 AD, Prior to this, Lithuania and Poland had an empire that took control of Ukraine. Under the Polish-Lithuanian rule, Ukrainian peasants were bound to the land as serfs. Out on the steppes, in the 1400s, many discontented peasants joined to form a rebel force called the Cossacks. The territory of the Cossacks lay between the Poles and the Tatars and was known as Ukraine, the Slavic meaning borderland. They fought the Tatars to the south, the Poles to the west. Poland continued to rule most of Ukraine until the 1600s. The Cossacks fiercely opposed Polish rule and fought the pressure of the Poles to convert to the Polish Catholic Church. In Lviv, western Ukraine, where my mom was born, the Ukrainians compromised. They accepted Catholicism, but under the form of a Greek Catholic Church. It's the only Catholic church that allows priests to be married, because that was a custom in the Orthodox Church. So in the Lviv area of western Ukraine, most of the Ukrainians are Catholic. We go to 1654. There was a huge conflict between Poland and Cossack Ukraine. Cossack leader Bogdan Khmelnytsky formed an alliance with Russia in order to oppose Polish rule. Big mistake. The Tsar promoted the Orthodox Church. As Russia gained control over Ukraine, the peasants were again subjected to the role of serfs, and the Cossack state was lost or dismembered. Ukrainians would continue to resist their harsh resistance, but with little success. The Tsars tried to replace the Ukrainian language, but only succeeded in the east and in the cities, but not in the countryside. The Ukrainian language persisted. The Ukrainian language, being a Slavic language, as is the Russian, is very different because most of the root words in Russian stem from other sources. So, in fact, Ukrainian language is much closer to the Polish language than to the Russian. In 1850, poet Taras Shevchenko led a revival of the Ukrainian language and culture. Others in the west of Ukraine followed, like Ivan Franko and Lasio Ukrainka. The historian Michael Hrushevsky wrote many books stressing how separate Ukraine's history was from Russia's in language, culture, and so forth. Putin simply has not read history. I'm going to take you now to World War I. We're 1917. The Russian front against Germany settled over western Romania. That's where my dad was born in 1919. And Lviv, where my mom was born in 1923. That area became part of Poland after the war, and my dad's birthplace became part of Romania. So essentially, these two areas where my parents were born were part of Ukraine, but not part of USSR in 1922. Ukraine, after a failed attempt to establish their independence, became an original member of the USSR, as the Ukrainian SSR, with other members, Russia, Belarus, and Caucasia. In the United Nations, Ukrainian SSR flew their flag. So what happened in 1918? The Bolshevik Revolution under Lenin gained control of Russia and Ukraine. There was a huge civil war between the Red Communist Army and the White Army. Interestingly, sponsored by allies UK, USA, France, and Japan. But the peasants feared the autocratic right wing of the whites, joined the Red Army, and the rest is history. In 1922, Stalin became Secretary General under Lenin. Lenin died of a stroke in 1924. Stalin exposed Trotsky, forced him to Mexico, and then sent assassins to kill him. Stalin took over the Soviet Union, ruled with an iron fist. It's interesting. His assumed name of Stalin is Russian for steel. The first 5-year plan, 1928 to 1933. Stalin set this up, sent hundreds of thousands of successful Ukrainian farmers, the kulaks, to Siberia and forces the collective farms on the Ukrainians. They resisted, so Stalin set up a program described as the Red Famine. In 1931 and 32, he took away all the harvests, sends the harvest to the factory workers in the cities, and sells the rest to the European countries for cash. He even went as far as to have his security people go house to house in the villages and took all of their food supplies. The result, no crops, 5 to 10 million dead from starvation, stories of cannibalism, pure evil. They call this in Ukraine the Holodomor. Holod in Ukrainian is starve. More is Latin or French for death, death by starvation. So Stalin then sent into Ukraine many Russian farmers because there were no Ukrainian farmers left in the east. And the process of Russification began, especially in eastern Ukraine. Now, my mom and dad were not dealing with this because they were under Polish and Romanian authorities. So my dad was able to get technical training with certification in toolmaking, metallurgy, welding by the time World War II happened. He had a Romanian certificate, which he was able to apply for his professional career in Canada later. My mom got primary schooling and learned seamstress work by the time she was 16 when the war broke. So 1933 to 1939, huge oppositions to Stalin resulted in the Great Purge. Over 1 million Ukrainians were sent to Siberia to the Gulag. Others were simply executed. World War II. What happened? Ukraine is the borderland, remember? And Ukraine then was the borderland between the Germans and the Soviets. What happened? Germany attacks Poland and claims victory in 6 weeks. Hitler sets up a non-aggression pact with Stalin. They divide Eastern Europe, and particularly Poland. Areas of Lviv, where my mom lived, and Romania, where my dad, now became officially part of the Soviet Union. The Soviets took over my grandfather's blacksmith shop, and they sent him and my dad to do menial janitorial work in one of their factories. Hitler decides to invade USSR, June 1941, and takes over Ukraine and is in Kiev with his army by December 1941. My dad had refused to fight for Stalin's army and joined the underground Ukrainian army under Melnik, and he trained there until the spring of 1942. These Ukrainians at first thought the Germans would be liberators from communist Stalin regime. My dad and others were to meet with Göring, the underground warriors, in Kiev to set up the association. Hitler had other ideas about Ukrainians. Germans reneged on giving Ukrainians associate status like they had with Romania and Hungary, and 20,000 Ukrainian underground soldiers who met in Kiev were sacrificed at Baba Yar in Kiev that spring, along with 50 or 60,000 Ukrainian Jews. Somehow, my dad and his friend learned of this betrayal, and they escaped with his friend only to be caught by German sentries. My dad had thrown all his Ukrainian citizenship papers away, claimed he was Romanian. He had his Romanian certificate of technical school, and so the sentry sent him and his buddy to undergo court-martial procedures in Lviv. But when they got to that train station, he and his buddy got the sergeant at arms drunk. They escaped into Lviv. They signed up to be students at the Lviv Polytechnical University in the summer of 1942, run by members of the Ukrainian underground. But in 1943, Hitler needed slave labor, and all Ukrainian men and women were sent to slave camps. My dad claimed his Romanian citizenship, and so he was sent as a skilled steelworker to the Krupp Steelworks in Essen, Germany, to help in the war machine. At least he was able to have 2 square meals a day. My mom was sent to a labor camp, but she and her friend escaped at the train station in Vienna. They were picked up by a Nazi engineer who needed domestic help, and she became a young governess, childcare, sewing, and cooking. Eventually, the war comes to an end. My parents ended up in Western Austria, in Salzburg. Sound, the music city, was under control, thank God, of the Americans. My parents lived in this refugee camp for 3 years before they got sponsored to go to Canada. The rest is history. Now, even then, the Russians did not stop attempting to repatriate Ukrainians from these refugee camps. However, unlike the British, who allowed these Ukrainians to get repatriated, the Americans already were suspicious of the motives of the communists and refused to cooperate. In fact, they would tell my dad, go to the forest, the sentries are coming, we will blow the whistle, and you can come out, you'll be safe. And so the refugees were able to learn English prior to their sponsorship. It was interesting that the priest that married my parents in Salzburg immigrated to Canada, and then he set up a sponsorship to allow my parents to get their visas to immigrate to Canada. So I have no contact ever with any of my uncles, aunts, or my grandparents. My dad left behind 4 sisters. A brother happened to immigrate to Canada, and my mom left behind 6 siblings. I have over 20 cousins alive in Western Ukraine, along with an untold number of nieces and nephews. 6 nephews have gone into the army to fight the Russians. All males 18 to 60 in Ukraine have to stay in the country to support the war. My only relative that I ever knew was my dad's younger brother, who amazingly bought a house just a mile away from my home, so we had that family togetherness. In 1953, Stalin dies of a stroke, and in 1956, Khrushchev assumes control. He's much less brutal, but the regime keeps Ukraine a closed society. Khrushchev gifted the Crimean Peninsula to the Ukrainian SSR at this time. That's the history of Crimea from the Tatars to 1956. Brezhnev is not much better, and then we get to 1991, and Gorbachev regime and glasnost ends the USSR. Ukraine gets established as an independent country, along with all the other members of the Soviet Union in 1991. And then there's a key moment on December 5th, 1994, called the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine had many nuclear weapons. United Kingdom, United States, Russia, and Ukraine signed on this memorandum. This is why the UK and the USA have a moral duty in protecting Ukraine. These four countries recognized Ukraine's independence and the existing borders, and Ukraine would therefore destroy their nuclear arsenal. United States and the UK would ensure protection of Ukraine's geographic integrity and sovereignty. I guess Putin hasn't read that memorandum. 10 years later, there's the Orange Revolution, November 2004. In this election, a Russian-sponsored politician won, quote-unquote, the election. Mr. Yanukovych was very much a Putinite. However, investigations revealed that the election was full of stuffed ballot boxes. The election was deemed fraudulent. A new election was ordered. And this is where my brothers, Emil and Roman, became international monitors of the election process in Ukraine, along with other Canadian and Europeans. The victor was Mr. Yushchenko, who, as you might have recalled, was poisoned during the campaign, but survived. He was permanently disfigured in his face from the poisoning, another technique of Putin's regime. In 2006, in the deputy elections for the parliament, were monitored by an international group, including my brother, Emil. He ended up going to Ukraine every 2 years for monitoring elections until 2014. In 2010, Yushchenko lost to the Putin favorite Yanukovych. When the eastern and more Russified Ukrainians voted in a Russian-Ukrainian over Yushchenko due to apathy from the West. In 2012, in the deputy election for parliament, pro-Russian anti-NATO deputies won many seats in what was a confusing campaign because Ukrainian candidates lost access to marketing, TV time, and so forth. So in 2014, with the support from these pro-Russian deputies, Yanukovych, pro-Russian prime minister, announced that Ukraine will abandon an association agreement with the EU and will not seek NATO membership. This was a complete reversal. The Ukrainian public went livid. They wanted to be part of Europe eventually. In Kyiv, they started to have mass rallies at the public square called the Maidan. This was called the Revolution of Dignity. It was peaceful. Many were opposed to the corruption of Yanukovych's regime. His presidential home was built super lavish style at a cost of $500 million when people couldn't find $10 a day at work. His presidential home has been now converted to a museum. In January, Yanukovych's security people shot 100 peaceful protesters on the Maidan, and the Ukrainian public went ballistic. Peacefully, the parliament voted to have Yanukovych arrested for corruption. He got wind of it. Putin helped with the escape, and he took his suitcases of money and landed by helicopter in Moscow. Putin was livid that the Ukrainians had that much audacity to peacefully remove a corrupt president. The interim government and later the Poroshenko government signed a trade agreement with the EU, a first step towards membership. Putin went ballistic. Russia invaded, annexed Crimea, a Ukrainian territory. two secessionist regions in the Donetsk and Luhansk, the so-called Donbass, tried to break away from Ukraine with Russian help. The Ukrainian army went to war to reclaim the Donbass in far eastern Ukraine. During the past 10 years, 13,000 Ukrainian soldiers died, and the front lines remained static for 8 years until the Minsk Agreement, where a ceasefire agreement was signed by Ukraine, France, Germany, and Russia. Then in 2019, an actor, Volodymyr Zelensky, is elected president of Ukraine with 70% support of the electorate. He promised to continue to seek EU membership to free up the Donbass area. He sought to replenish the Ukrainian army with supplies from a reluctant America. He was firmly opposed to closer ties to Russia. Putin called the Zelensky government a ruling, crime-riddled Nazi regime, despite the fact that Mr. Zelensky and his family is Jewish and family members had died in the Holocaust. 2021 to 2022, Putin wanted to stop Ukraine's drift towards the EU and NATO. He demanded security guarantees that included Ukraine never joining NATO, and Putin demanded that NATO pull back troops that were stationed in countries adjoining Ukraine. And then, to the world's horror, on February the 24th, 2022, Putin's Russia invades and attacks Ukraine in an unprovoked war to destroy Ukraine. I have to say that my dad, who passed away on January 16th, 2010, is crying in his grave. It is so sad. And at our next session, we will continue this discussion, including a long discussion on modern Ukrainian nationalism and what my brothers have set up as a foundation to help with the refugees.
Anton,
Yes.
you have so much information. It's just incredible and beautiful and sad. As Anton has stated, we will be having a second podcast to follow this. That's going to get into the issues of current Ukraine, and also his two brothers, or one brother, that has a foundation that's being run out of Canada to help refugees, women and children, because the men are still having to stay behind and fight there. And Anton will tell you about the many families that they have been able to bring into Canada, find housing and work and education for, and that effort still goes on. Just a couple of questions, Anton. All the while that that I was growing up, Eastern Europe was so distant, really behind a very dark curtain, and I remember always calling Ukraine the Ukraine. We didn't call it Ukraine; we called it the Ukraine. And when you talked about Ukraine being borderland, that was the word for borderland. That made sense. Is that it was the borderland?
Yes.
And just recently with the invasion, I have heard Ukrainians just putting their foot down and say, "We are not the Ukraine.
Correct.
We are Ukraine. We are a sovereign nation."
Yes.
But in the history of that, seemed like it was a breadbasket. Where they grew the wheat for the rest of the USSR, and to our very good fortune and the very good fortune of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, saw a young actor, president, stand up to tanks and bombs and everything else and said, this is our country. This is our country. But we're going to get into more of that in our next podcast, along with Anton's Family's Foundation. But right now, I want to say thank you to our members and the member of the broader public who have listened to this podcast, and make sure that you turn into our second one to find out more about the Academy for Lifelong Learning, and to also listen to the story of Anton's family. We'd love to have you contact us at capecodall.org, and please get on our mailing list. Once you're on our mailing list, you'll receive our catalog of courses, which is the backbone of ALL, and information about our events, our speakers, as well as get our weekly newsletter, which will have more of these interesting podcasts about our instructors and our members. We'd love to have you sign up for our courses. We're also looking for new coordinators to add to our rich curriculum. We have many openings for volunteers on many boards, including helping us here at the broadcast studio. There's plenty of work to do in keeping what I call a mini college going with a volunteer staff. Remember to like us on Facebook, and also to find us on YouTube, where you will find our podcasts and our broadcasts. If anybody would like to contribute to Anton's Brothers Foundation, I'm going to ask that you contact me or send a contribution to me, Joan Friedman, at the Academy of Lifelong Learning at 2240 I&O Road in West Barnstable, Mass. And if you send anything to me, I will make sure that Anton receives it, and we can forward that on to his brother. So again, Anton and I would like to thank you for listening, and remember again to contact us at capecodall.org.